Hey guys, it's Nick. Welcome to another episode of T-365. Today's episode, I'm going to show you the best practices as it relates to securing and managing local admin accounts across your end user devices across your customers. We're going to go everywhere between the password management as well as some of the unique considerations for newer age technologies like just-in-time access. So stay tuned because I'm going to show you also the first-party solution bundles that are available that will help you manage this, as well as some of the top third-party solutions in the space as well too, specifically made for MSPs. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Nick. I'm a Microsoft MVP and I've been creating content here on the channel for the better half of a decade. If you haven't already, definitely subscribe to the channel and check out my blog at t-365.com. Otherwise, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, so getting into it here, definitely a lot of heavy security concerns when we talk about mismanagement of local admin passwords, but also specifically around just allowing users to be local admins on their devices. When we talk about these concepts here as a recurring theme for all the security recommendations I'm going to provide, really talking about your standards as an MSP. And when we say that, you're really just saying that this is everything that I can do and support from an operational sense, but also as my security baselines that I'm going to try to institute in every single one of my customers. So as one of these baselines here that you would likely have when we talk about your user management, when we talk about local admins on the device versus standard users, we're often cases obviously just going to go ahead and green light all of the users being standard accounts, and we're not going to allow any of them to be an admin on the device. That's going to help prevent them installing potentially malicious applications or something that is working a certain process that is malicious in nature as well too. So that's just going to be a heavy security concern that we want to go ahead and make sure that is our baseline policy. Now when we inadvertently go ahead and do this, we automatically have to then go and say that we are going to manage these local admin accounts now as well within the tenant, just because we need a way in order to have those local privileges when we need to perform certain actions that we'll get to here in a second. But from the operational sense, when we talk about the management and we talk about the operations in general that come when we do this type of activity, what we really see is that our ticket volume, if you haven't already done this yet, is going to go up quite significantly, just because users are inadvertently going to try to install applications they need for their business or certain processes that need to make changes on the device that only a local admin can perform. And so from an operational sense, there's obviously a myriad of different areas that this could get into, but I like to bucketize these in two major categories. The first of which is just simply break fix. This is your technicians going in and needing to elevate their privileges on the account to perform some type of troubleshooting or remediation. And I'm going to bucketize this pretty highly, but app install or app updates is typically the most, or the second highest volume that we would see in a customer site where they need us to go in and actually review that application and use the local admin privileges to perform the action of the app install or the app update. QuickBooks is a common example, right, of this, where QuickBooks needs to install the updates. The user cannot do that with just standard rights. They're going to have to open a ticket up with you. We'll get into some of the third-party solutions that help solve for this as well too, but this is kind of the core operational sense that you need to keep in mind when we put this blanket level security protection of making sure all of our users are standard accounts. So if we get into this overall management layer here, I think we have a couple of considerations that we want to keep into mind here as far as what we are actually managing on those local admin accounts. The first thing I'm going to be talking with you today on is just overall password management and where you're storing those passwords, who has access to them, things like that as well. That's a very big deal as it relates to these accounts in general. And then we're also going to be talking about access controls as a whole, just when it relates to who can access these types of accounts, when are they accessing them, who within your organization can see even the passwords that we're granting or storing here within our local environment. And then lastly here, we also have considerations for auditing. And it's basically asking the question of how periodically do we audit these individual accounts? Do we have any tracking in place that can see when these were used, when their passwords are updated, things like that? It's all part of what I'm going to cover here. But first, let's go ahead and get into the password management side here, because that's one of our heaviest considerations when thinking about managing these accounts. Okay, so on the password management side, let's talk about some of the common bad practices that I still see out there to a decent degree. First of which is just password reuse, which is simply saying that we have the same password across devices in the environment. That not only increases your attack surface, but allows for lateral movement within the account if one account is compromised there. Just a bad practice as a whole. I don't see that too often, but I have seen it in a few environments. The second of which is just insecure or weak passwords or lack of password rotation. And so a lot of us have overcome, the simple weak password concept where it's not susceptible as much to brute force attacks or password spray attempts. But the password rotation piece, I think, is still a gap here that I've seen. We're not, as far as best practice security hygiene goes, not rotating that password on a periodic basis. And then the last one here is just insecure storage or use of the accounts as a whole. And the passwords are associated with that as well too. And when we think about the storage locations of which we are managing these at legacy times, and still I see this even today, some of us out there are still using RMM with PowerShell scripts to really manage the local admin accounts and the subsequent passwords. Some of us also use local Active Directory. We're going to be covering the Windows Lapse solution a little bit later. But this is something that you had in previous times as well too, that allows you to manage these passwords. Fortunately, it was also not encrypted. It was in plain text on user attributes. We've upgraded that since that time, but just another consideration there. A lot of us today store it in a documentation tool like IT Glue, and that specifically has a lot of popularity just because it has ease of access for our technicians to consume whenever our users are opening up tickets with us. We also have this potentially being stored in password managers today, like Keeper, 1Password, things like that as well. And I think inherently you have obviously your supply chain risk when you start porting these passwords over to these different locations. They're not inherently weak by default, but where I see a lot of breakdowns here is specifically around your access control list. And this is just layered security again. There's a lot of considerations here, but it's basically saying or asking yourself the question, can anybody in my MSP access the local admin passwords within the RMM or within the IT Glue environment? And if so, can I document that? Is it audited by any means? And I don't think that a lot of us are in that state today. I think they're just accessible by any technician for any customer. And it kind of brings some weaknesses to this when you think about any user, any person being breached. Things like IP address lockdowns, things like that might be something you have incorporated, but I just wanted to call it out here as it's another concern here for just the general use case of managing these passwords. So the other consideration that I want to get into here is just kind of the best practices for these passwords and overall account management. The first of which is just having dedicated accounts for these local admin accounts. And this is specifically to say that this isn't a regular user that's logging in. This is somebody that we use internally whenever we need to perform those activities that I talked about earlier in the sense of break fix or elevation, uplifted elevation for application installs, program changes, things like that. And this is number one, so we can do proper auditing against these records periodically or in the event of a breach. And the other byproduct of that is hopefully that you could derive some advanced alerting for suspicious or malicious activity against these accounts. So that's one of the best practices to start there. Complex passwords, very straightforward, but I like to set at least a 15-character password that's complex with different characters, letters, symbols, things of that nature. We have periodic password rotation. And that is simply to say that you're periodically rotating these passwords on a defined schedule. I like to do this every 30 days or less. And if there wasn't automated solutions in place, I'd say that's pretty unfeasible, but this is very reachable for us to do in an automated fashion today. And I'm going to be showing you some of those solutions as well too. Next here is just simply encryption at rest and in transit. Again, I mentioned in previous legacy times, this used to just be an unencrypted plain text password that was listed on the property of the user within local AD. Subsequently, it's been updated. I'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about Windows Lapse. And then the last one here that I want to discuss is just auditing in general. So it's coming back to this thought of we have a way that we can collect audit log records against these accounts when they're used, who they're used by, as well as when their passwords were updated, and things of that nature as well too. So you just have a complete trail to go look at any type of suspicious or malicious activity as well. Okay, so this is the overall best practices for password management. I'll show you some of the first party and third party solutions here in a little bit to help manage these in more of an automated fashion, more secure fashion than you could ever do manually within your MSP. But the next thing I want to talk about here is just taking a look at some of the additional management considerations with these particular accounts as well too. So when we think about, more of the advanced management components that we would get into, again, we're thinking about our ops or operations here when it comes to overall user management. I talked about how our ticket volume is going to greatly spike. But at the same time, what also happens, obviously, when we have this higher ticket volume is, generally speaking, our response time goes down because we just can't handle it or scale up to the level of request. And subsequently, the user experience goes down as well too, meaning our end users are more frustrated with us because we're saying it's going to take longer to fulfill the request, and they get very frustrated about that when we talk about, just basic application updates on their device or application installs that they feel they need to be productive at their job. Subsequently, when we think about this as a whole, we can also think that, at the end of the day, when we talk about increasing tickets, decreased response time, decreased user satisfaction, we're also looking at decreased customer profitability when we talk about these solutions as well as a byproduct, mostly because we're spending more time for the same dollar amount with the customer unless you go back and renegotiate that, or they're on block hours or something of that nature. Most cases for managed customers, they're going to be on a set fixed cost on a per endpoint per user rate. And this is just overall just driving down our cost or our profits across that customer. And it's actually increasing, our just reactive nature of what we're doing here as well too. So from a security sense, if we switch from the operational realm into the security realm, we also have to think about what else we want to do here to begin to alleviate our operational burden, but also increase our security at the same time. So when we talk about this, we get into some more broad-based security concepts, such as elevation control and just-in-time access. And these are a little bit more advanced, but they also help out greatly with obviously bumping up our security, but they should help with your overall operations. So elevation control is basically saying, what process do you take as an MSP to make sure that somebody could temporarily elevate their privileges into admin rights to be able to perform that admin action that's an approved action. And then you also have just-in-time access, which is basically saying, can we grant access or elevate our access into an admin role or create the admin role in the time that we need it, and then bring it back down or remove it altogether when we're done. It's also commonly known as just simply a PAM solution, privileged access management solution. And we'll get into, again, some of the first party and third party with this as well. The other considerations that you have when we start talking about solutioning around this is commonly known as application whitelisting, or ring fencing is another common term that you'll hear related to this as well too. But effectively here, when we talk about starting to bucketize these solutions, this is basically saying that we're embodying a model at the end of the day of zero trust. And that is to say that we, or something that makes changes to our device, such as something that requires a local admin privilege, has to earn our trust before it can do that. So that includes the applications that get installed or updated, as well as anything that's manipulating processes or programs on that device as well too. So if we think about this context here, we're talking about zero trust. I also want to get into the concepts of defense in depth and layered security. So we're talking, again, holistically about managing the admin accounts. We also just think about how we're managing what those accounts are actually ended up going and doing, and how can we get a nice blend of uptaking our security and decreasing our operational overhead. So when we talk about this in general, and we talk about zero trust, I generally want to start discussing kind of this layered approach again as well too. And it's asking the question, and a lot of us out there, that are managing this, begin the question, do you need additional solutions in place? I'm basically asking the question, is EDR enough, or MDR? We're talking about protecting our devices. And so when we think about, the standard user rights and the local admin rights, I'm going to call this first layer is basically our layer for, some of the things that we're discussing here for elevation control, as well as just-in-time access, as well as application whitelisting as well too. So kind of these solutions that you would put on this exterior barrier. And then this barrier here, as far as what we're going to define, is our EDR solution on the endpoint as well. And so fundamentally, if we think about attack, just in general as far as an example goes, we have some considerations here where attackers can actually still bypass local admin rights with a standard user control and install certain applications on the device that actually could be malicious. We've seen it in the past, but basically also when you think about a normal attack, if we're saying that this layer does not exist in general, an attacker can go ahead and just say, let's just make the example of you haven't actually downgraded people's rights to a standard user, they're local admins. They actually go ahead and install this application here at this layer. And so it's starting to install, and then you have maybe a SentinelOne or a Defender for Business here acting on the device. It will actually detect that, and maybe it'll prevent that from moving forward at this layer as well. But the key thing to note here is that this was already installed, it's already in motion. So you're kind of already operating from a post-breach mentality versus just putting protective measures in place or preventative measures in place so that it doesn't even get to this layer. So this piggybacks off the concept of defense in depth or a layered approach to security, where I think it's pertinent to have additional controls here that we start to look at. And this is all, again, helping us become more preventative than reactive in nature. And it'll lessen the security concerns that we should have within the business as well. When we talk about some of the other considerations here, you might be looking at something like controlled folder access with Microsoft that prevents tampering to certain files or directories as well too, helps a lot with certain types of ransomware that you can get into. But effectively here, again, it's following a model of zero trust, and we're never going to be able to get to the state where we can understand exactly what all applications or processes we're going to need to whitelist. But we can do that over time. And as the MSP, we just have to have a really good process that's really well defined around how to manage that across our customers as well. So at the end of the day, when I talk about a solution bundle to be able to account for our management of both the local admin privileges and subsequently the actions from a local admin privilege perspective, we're going to talk about a few here, and then I'm going to talk to you about the first party and third party availability of solutions that you have at your disposal here. So really, we're talking about password management for local admins, just in general. We're talking about local admin management as a whole. We're talking about elevation control. Talking about application whitelisting. And inadvertently, when we think about the full end-to-end process of how a technician is going to perform these actions, at the end of the day across that device, we're also inadvertently going to be talking about remote access as well. So with this in mind, let's take a look first at Microsoft's first-party solutions that can accommodate for these different areas. Okay, so when we talk about Microsoft's first-party solutions, let's talk about password management as a whole. And we're going to start off with Windows Lapse. Many of us might be familiar with this, have used it in the past, but it's a really great solution that is extended into a modern cloud-native environment here as well. So you can still choose whether or not this is cloud-native. And this, by the way, stands for Local Administrator Password Solution. And this allows us to manage a lot of the best practices that I talked about with passwords on those devices, like the password complexity, how often it's rotated, the actual definition of the account on the device, as well as some of the audit logs that you get as well too. When we talk about cloud native labs, we're talking about using Entra or having Entra joined devices, as well as using Intune as our MDM platform to push out policy to devices. You could also be running this in a hybrid environment where we're using still hybrid joined devices, but we're still leveraging, at the end of the day, Entra and local AD. Combination using AD sync or Entra sync to push those devices up into the cloud. And then we're using GPOs still to push out policy definitions to those devices, which then inherently is going to take the policy definition of our password policy that we're going to establish here. So let me go ahead and show you what this looks like within Entra so you can understand what policies you'll be configuring, the various settings, and how you can actually manage this within the Entra portal.
Okay, so first in the Entra portal here, if you go under devices and the overview, you'll have a section in here for device settings. And down at the bottom, there's a setting here for lapse, and you can just toggle it on to yes and click on save here at the top of the page. This comes as part of any of your base licensing, so there's no additional add-ons that you need to do in order to be able to enable this setting. If we're thinking about a cloud native approach though, and pushing this policy out through Intune, I'm in the Intune Admin Center here, and I can go under the endpoint security section to go ahead and establish a policy. I'll go under the account protection section and I'll create a policy for Windows Lapse. So I'm going to select Windows 10 and later, and then a local admin password solution. Click on create here. It's going to create a test policy just to show you guys the settings here. And these are the ones that we get to configure. So we have a backup directory here. We've disabled backup the password to Azure AD only. They still haven't changed this to Entra, which is funny. Backup the password to the Active Directory only. The recommended setting here, even if you're running this in a hybrid environment and choosing Intune to manage this policy instead of a GPO, I would use the backup to Azure AD. The password agent days, this is something again we talked about. I recommended the 30-day period, but you could do more frequently if you really wanted to as well. Again, this is the service that's going to be rotating the passwords and storing them. So you need to be conscientious of that, and I'll show you where to grab those passwords within the platform here after you establish this policy. User account name, this is going to grab the default admin account. If it's not specified as something different, you can click on this and you can specify the admin prefix here for the admin username that is being used if you're going to be assigning that to an admin account or managing an account that is not the default admin that's created on the device. Password complexity here, this is something that I like to use this particular setting, improve readability. If you've dealt with this pain in the past, you know what I'm talking about here when we say improve readability, in the sense of had a lot of pain in the past using this solution with just the characters that were being leveraged and being able to actually copy those out and use them. So they fixed that with some of these recent updates. Password length, again, this is the one where I mentioned to do 15 characters. For the post authentication action, this is also really cool as well because it can actually automatically rotate the password after it's been used, and the technician uses that password to enter the device, or anybody really at the end of the day. But I like to choose the default setting here, which is to reset the password after that use, and any interactive sessions where the managed account was used in this particular case would be the default account. If we didn't specify anything, would be terminated. And then for the post authentication reset delay, this is in hours, and the minimum amount that you could define here would be 1 hour, so I could do that as well. The rest of the settings, obviously just Intune altogether. You just create your assignment and create the policy.
This will take some time to propagate, but after you've assigned it to devices, the devices that have that assigned will have this local admin password icon show up. When you're taking a look at an individual device, you're able to then see the local administrator password and view that for your own consumption. And this is where you would do this kind of as a technician managing this within the account. Additionally here, supporting the documentation here is this ability to rotate that password on demand using the ellipsis on the top of the device page. Okay, now that you've seen that, we also have, the hybrid consideration. I'm not going to walk through that. There's certainly other videos I can link that will show you how to set up the GPO, but very similar, obviously, right, where we're setting those policy definitions that we have for this. And this is really checking the box as far as password management, for our local accounts, just in general, and for what we have on those devices. We also get into, when we talk about elevation control, this is a newer solution from Microsoft, but this is actually abbreviated EPM for endpoint privilege management. And this is elevation control native into Microsoft Intune now. Just want to preface that and notice that here as well. This is an add-on license. I'll get into cost here in a minute, but this is something that you can add on and bolt on to elevate privileges temporarily for a user that requests it, or specifically you can auto set this on applications, so you don't have to have the user request. You can auto elevate into the admin role to self-update and not have to have the user even submit a support ticket to you as well. Next we have remote access here. This is another solution from Intune, more new in nature, but this is remote help. This is also in Intune, it's part of a bolt-on offering. Get into pricing again here in a minute, but this is their native remote access solution that you can use in the Intune Admin Center, and effectively it's agentless, which is the best part, honestly, in my opinion, about that as well. And so fundamentally, this is kind of some of the considerations here when we talk about the cloud native solutions that you can bundle together. And when we think about the last concept here that I want to get into, which is just-in-time access, or a PAM solution, or a PIM solution. So I think this isn't like a direct correspondence to what you would think about with other third-party solutions. That'll make more sense here in a minute, but effectively here, if we think about just-in-time access and using GDAP with our customers, we can actually create more of a just-in-time solution for how they can access or when they can access the local admin passwords within the Intune environment or within their Microsoft portals subsequently. And to do this, you would be using a PIM-enabled group within your partner tenant, and you basically be associating a couple of different roles in there that allow for the users to manage the LAP passwords across customers. They could elevate their privileges, document why they need to do so, to be able to elevate up and then access these passwords, making it a little bit more secure, a little bit more just in time as far as when they have rights to go in there and use that. And this is kind of just extending, the PAM concept into PIM, or privileged identity management, with something that's native with our partner center access. So I just wanted to call that out here as well too. But when we think about this solution, just in general, we have some considerations here for pros and cons. So when we think about the pros, the biggest pro, in my opinion, is that it's native. Again, meaning that you don't need an additional agent on a device, which inadvertently causes more risk to that device as well too. So this is really the biggest pro that you can really see with Intune, and with using some of those native solutions there as well. There's certainly a lot of cons, which is kind of the counterexample to make to the third-party solution as well. But the biggest cons that I see here, these solutions are not multi-tenant capable today, so it's kind of inadvertent to our MSP operations. Subsequently, they are not integrated with our MSP tools. Most specifically, our ticketing system by default. I'm not saying that you couldn't create a custom solution that would integrate with your ticketing solution. It's just not native, right? They're not saying, hey, connect to ConnectWise and push your tickets in here. And the same thing with documentation tools. So they're not going to be natively connecting to an IT glue and adding the passwords in there. And I actually think that's actually better in the long term for how you would want to manage this, but it's a heavy consideration for a lot of MSPs out there. Some of the biggest concern here is pricing and cost, I should say, really at the end of the day too. When we think about these tools, we think about Windows Labs is actually free. So it's no additional dollars to use that as part of your existing base licensing. But when we get into Intune endpoint privilege management, this is an additional $3 an endpoint per month or user. And then when we get into remote help from Intune, that is an additional $350 a user. So some heavy considerations here, and we compare that if you think about your remote access solution tied to your third-party solution you might be using today for elevation control application whitelisting, you might be talking about upwards of a 33% increase in cost, at least, using these types of tools today. And you don't have these other benefits in here of them being multi-tenant capable, integrating with MSP tools, the pricing and cost. The other thing here that we have to consider is also just server password management, database password management. The other third-party solutions kind of accommodate for all that all together versus just having this isolated to the endpoints themselves. So all of that we really have to take in consideration here. You might also argue that, just piggybacking off of my comments on GDAP and JIT, that's just way too much overhead for somebody to consume, and you'll actually decrease your response times, resolution times on those tickets. So I could see that here as well. Okay, so when we talk about third-party solutions here, I'm going to talk about some of the most popular in the space. This is by no means all-inclusive, but these are some of the ones that I see the most prevalent here. Just to name a few: CyberQP, CyberFox, and ThreatLocker. And so these tools are going to be very MSP friendly, and they are going to help you and kind of offboard the password management for these accounts, as well as looking at some of the unique considerations for like basically heightened considerations for privileges that you can have out of the box. So when we talk about this, we're talking about, again, password management. We're talking about things like JIT or just-in-time access built into the solution natively, where you don't have to think about doing something very custom for that. You have basic things already in here like application whitelisting, as well as, elevation control built in. So very powerful solutions, and again, they're kind of solving and offboarding the need to do this within Microsoft or use Windows Labs in any situation. The pros here, kind of the opposite of what we just talked about as far as the cons, right, with Microsoft, being that they're multi-tenant capable. They have integration with our PSA tool, documentation tools, things like that. They support overall password management, including servers, things like that as well. And subsequently, I think one of the biggest pros is that they just fit much better into our MSP operations because of their integrations, because of how they flow through from just the admin perspective. In some cases, a little bit more secure with things like JIT participating in there. But when we talk about the cons here of these tools, I certainly think the biggest con that you have is just the agent. You're putting another agent on the device. We've all seen what can happen either maliciously or just from a bad update, right? With CrowdStrike as an example, and not to say that these tools are susceptible to that, but any tool is at the end of the day, and we have to be cognizant of that, of how many agents and how much more third-party risk we're putting out in our environment. I think the other thing is here, from a con perspective, is just thinking about TCO. So if you can do a lot of this in Microsoft, not talking about the Intune add-ons that you would get, but if you think about our basic licensing with Windows Labs and maybe creating some custom automation in there with Power Automate, Are you spending a lot, and what are you getting out of that? Based off of what you can do here, and how much are you frustrating your users by putting in these types of solutions in place that are you readily able to accommodate for. I think the other thing that we're seeing from these tools today as a last pro is they're kind of taking the playbook out of an MDR tool or an EDR tool, and they're basically saying they'll do managed response on these elevation requests or requests that come in from your end users. They'll detect if this is a malicious file or not, or if it should be approved, and they'll basically offboard that for a fee, obviously. But in a lot of cases, that might be a better use of your money to upgrade to that higher tier where they're doing the managed response, just simply because it's way more cost effective than if you hired another technician to accommodate, and your customer satisfaction is remaining at the same because your end users aren't super frustrated about your response times. So that's everything I had for you guys today. I hope this was super helpful. I know this was a longer video, but I wanted to cover all the unique considerations, not only for managing the local admin accounts, but subsequently the things that we're doing with those local admin accounts. In my blog, I'll have links to these third-party providers, as well as some helpful links to the first-party solutions if you want to check those out as well too. As always though, leave any comments or any questions that you had, and like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already to see more content around Microsoft and the MSP space. Thanks guys, I'll see you next week.